The gavel came down so hard it split the air like a gunshot, and Ellen Dalton felt the sound in her teeth. "Order!" Judge Harlan Price bellowed, his face the color of a bad sunset, red and ugly and promising nothing good. "I said order in this court. But the courtroom in Caldwell, Kansas would not have order. Not today. Not after what had just happened." Ellen stood at the front of the room, her hands shaking so badly she had to press them flat against the wooden railing to keep anyone from seeing. She had been standing there for 2 hours. 2 hours of being called a liar. 2 hours of watching the faces of the people she had lived among for 3 years turn against her like weather, like a sky that had gone dark without warning. Her landlady, Mrs. Hooper, sat in the second row with her lips pressed so thin they had nearly disappeared. The men from the Cattle Association filled the back half of the room, their arms crossed, their hats pulled low, their silence louder than anything the judge had said. Reginald Cobb's lawyer, a weasel-faced man named Thaddeus Orrin who had come all the way from Wichita, was smiling. He had been smiling since the moment Ellen had taken the stand, and that smile had not wavered once, not when she described finding the deed, not when she explained about the night she had gone to the land office and seen Cobb's man burning the original survey documents, not even when she broke down crying in front of everyone because she could not make them believe her. The smile had only grown. "The testimony of Miss Dalton," Thaddeus Orrin had said in his smooth, oiled voice, "amounts to nothing more than the desperate fabrications of a woman who owes 3 months of back rent and is looking for any reason to deflect blame from her own dishonesty onto a man of standing and reputation." The room had murmured in agreement. That murmur had been the thing that nearly broke her, because nobody believed her. Not a single soul in that courtroom had looked at her with anything resembling faith in their eyes. She was nobody. She was the seamstress who rented a room above the dry goods store. She had no husband, no father, no brother in this town. She had nothing but the truth, and the truth had not been enough. And then the door at the back of the courtroom had opened. The sound of it cut through the noise the way a clean knife cuts through bread, and every head in the room turned. Ellen turned too, because the silence that followed that opening door was different from any silence she had heard all morning. It was the kind of silence that had weight to it. Marshal Elijah Fletcher walked in like he had all the time in the world. He was not a large man in the way that Cobb's hired men were large, all bulk and threat. He was lean in the way that the plains were lean, nothing wasted, nothing soft, everything made for the purpose of enduring. He wore his badge on his vest, the way other men wore their names, without apology. His dark eyes moved across the room once slowly, and when they found Ellen at the front, they stayed there for a moment that lasted much longer than it should have. Then he walked to the center of the aisle, removed his hat, and turned to face the judge. "Marshal Fletcher," Judge Price said, his voice shifting into something cautious. "This proceeding is not. I know what this proceeding is, Judge." His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need volume because it had been trained by years in open country where being heard meant the difference between life and death. "I came to say something, and I am going to say it." The room held its breath. Elijah Fletcher turned then. He turned to face not the judge, not the lawyer, not Reginald Cobb who sat at the respondent's table with his fat watch chain gleaming. He turned to face the room, all of it. Every rancher and shopkeeper and dry goods man and widow woman who had sat there for 2 hours and decided that Ellen Dalton was a liar. "Miss Dalton came to my office 6 weeks ago," he said. "She told me what she had seen at the land office. She described the documents. She gave me names. I looked into every single thing she told me. The silence became absolute. And I am standing here in front of every one of you," he said, "to tell you that I believe her, every word of it." Ellen's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes burned. She had not cried when Thaddeus Orrin called her a liar. She had not cried when Mrs. Hooper had looked away. But now, in the space of those 7 words, something inside her came apart at the seams, because someone had finally said it. Someone with a badge and a name that this town respected had stood up in front of everyone and said he believed her, and nothing in Caldwell, Kansas would ever be the same again. 6 weeks earlier, Ellen Dalton had arrived at the door of the marshal's office at 20 minutes past 9 in the evening, which was not a respectable hour for a woman to be visiting a lawman's office, and she had known that, and she had come anyway. She had been in Caldwell for 3 years. She had arrived in 1881 with a battered trunk, a sewing box her mother had left her, and the name of a woman named Grace Alcott who had advertised for a seamstress in a newspaper Ellen had found at the stage depot in Missouri. Grace had turned out to be kind and practical, and they had built something together over those 3 years, a small seamstress shop that serviced the wives and daughters of the ranching families and the cattle drovers who passed through during the season. Then Grace had died in February of a fever that had taken her in less than a week, and Ellen had found herself alone again, not just without a friend, but without the legal anchor of Grace's name on the shop lease. The landlord, who worked for Reginald Cobb's business interests, had informed her within 2 weeks of Grace's death that her situation was being reviewed. She had not understood then how deep Cobb's reach went. She had not understood how many threads in this town led back to his fat fingers. But she had begun to understand it on the night of March the 14th, when she had gone to the land office after dark, because she had left her mending basket there earlier in the day and needed the half-finished vest for a customer's morning fitting. The land office clerk, a nervous young man named Percy Webb, also rented space from one of Cobb's subsidiary holdings, and Percy sometimes asked Ellen to do small sewing jobs in exchange for letting her use his office table when her own shop was too cold in the early spring weeks. She had seen the light under the door and assumed Percy was working late. She had pushed the door open and instead found a man she did not know feeding papers into the iron stove, while Percy stood against the far wall looking like he might be sick. The man feeding papers into the fire had looked up at her, and for one terrible moment the two of them had simply stared at each other. Then he had said, very quietly, "You did not see anything." And Ellen, because she was not a fool, had said, "No, I did not," and she had backed out of the office and walked 3 blocks in the cold night air before she had let herself shake. She had not slept that night. She had lain in her room above the dry goods store and stared at the dark ceiling and catalogued every detail she had noticed in those few seconds. The man's face, the stamps on the upper right corner of the documents before they went into the fire, the seal she had glimpsed, which she recognized as the state surveyor's office seal because she had seen it on the survey map Grace had framed on the wall of the shop for decoration. 2 words she had read upside down on one document before it curled into flame: Dalton Creek. Dalton Creek was the waterway that cut across the northeastern corner of 3 homesteading families' land. Families who had been in quiet dispute with Cobb's cattle operation about water access for 2 seasons now. By morning she had understood enough to be frightened. She had spent 3 weeks trying to decide what to do, and the thing that had decided her in the end was not bravery. It was a letter she received from Cobb's business manager informing her that her shop lease would not be renewed in April, and that furthermore her room rental was being increased to a figure she could not possibly afford. It was the realization that Cobb already knew she had been there, that he was already moving against her, quietly, carefully, using money and contracts where a cruder man might have used threats. The darkness that motivated a man like Cobb was not the darkness of rage. It was the darkness of cold arithmetic. And Ellen Dalton had realized she was already a number in his calculations, already marked for removal. So she had gone to the marshal's office at 20 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday evening, and she had knocked on the door, and Elijah Fletcher had opened it. She had expected someone older. The marshal's reputation in town was not a loud one, not the kind of legend that got repeated in saloons. It was quieter than that. He fixed things. He was the man people mentioned in passing when something had gone wrong and then subsequently right again, and there was rarely a dramatic story attached to it. That kind of lawman tended in her imagination toward gray and weathered. She had pictured someone her father's age. Instead, she found a man of perhaps 32 or 33, with dark eyes that assessed her in the space of a single second, and then opened the door wider without a word to let her inside. He had been in the middle of writing something at his desk, and the lamp was burning low, and the office smelled of leather and gun oil, and the particular dry smell of old paper. "Miss Dalton," he said, which surprised her because she had not thought he would know who she was. "Sit down." She sat. She had prepared what she was going to say. She had rehearsed it in her room, the order of facts, the sequence of events, the careful distance she had planned to maintain between what she knew and what she merely suspected. She had meant to be precise and unemotional. Instead, she said, "I think I may be in a great deal of trouble, and I think other people may be in worse trouble than I am, and I do not know what to do about it." He had set his pen down and looked at her with those steady dark eyes, and he had said, "Tell me what you saw." So she did, all of it. She told him about the land office and the burning documents and the man's face and the words she had read, Dalton Creek, upside down in firelight. She told him about the lease pressure and the rent increase. She told him about Percy Webb's face against the wall. She told him everything, and when she was done he was quiet for a long time, and she felt the familiar sinking certainty that she was about to be disbelieved. Instead he said, "Can you describe the man's face? The one burning the papers?" She could. She had a good memory for faces. She described him in detail, the long jaw, the scar along the left eyebrow, the particular color of his coat, which had been a dark tobacco brown. Elijah Fletcher had written every word of it down without comment, and when she was finished he had looked at what he had written and then looked at her, and she had seen something shift in his expression. Not quite belief, not yet, but something preliminary to it. Recognition, perhaps. The look of a man who was hearing one piece click into a pattern he had already half seen. "You are staying at the room above Henderson's Dry Goods," he said. "Yes." "Starting tomorrow," he said, "I want you to stop going to the land office entirely. Stop working late. Go to and from your shop on the main street and do not deviate from that. Do not talk to Percy Webb." "You believe me," she said. It was not quite a question. He had looked at her directly, and something in that look had been so serious and so honest that it had felt like a hand extended in the dark. "I am going to find out," he said. "That is the best I can tell you tonight." She had nodded and risen to leave, and at the door she had paused because there was something in the quality of his silence behind her that made her turn. He was still watching her with that careful expression, as if he was already carrying something on her behalf. "Thank you," she said. He had simply nodded. It was enough. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of waiting that tested every reserve of patience Ellen possessed. She went to her shop. She sewed. She smiled at customers and hemmed skirts and replaced buttons and did not deviate from the main street by so much as a single step. She did not speak to Percy Webb, who she saw once from across the street and who looked away so quickly it told her everything she needed to know about where his loyalties lay and how frightened he was. Elijah Fletcher came to her shop 4 times in those 6 weeks, and each time he came in the middle of the day when the street was busy, and each time he looked at the display of thread and collar fabrics near the window as if he were considering purchasing something, which was so transparently implausible that it had almost made her smile despite everything. The first visit, 4 days after her evening at his office, he told her he had identified the man she had described. His name was Warren Bale, and he worked as a private land agent for Cobb's business operation. He had a record of civil disputes in 2 other counties involving property documentation. Nothing criminal on paper yet, but the shape of the pattern was becoming visible. The second visit, 2 weeks later, he told her that he had been in contact with the state surveyor's office in Topeka, and that there were indeed discrepancies in the filed records for the Dalton Creek corridor. 3 homestead filings that should have updated surveys attached to them were showing blank. She had gripped the edge of the counter so hard that her knuckles had gone white, because that meant she had been right, exactly right, and the weight of that rightness was not triumphant at all. It was terrifying. The third visit, he had simply checked on her. She had not realized that was what he was doing until he was leaving, when she understood that he had not actually told her anything new. He had asked if she was well. He had asked if anything unusual had happened. He had looked at her with those careful dark eyes and waited until she told him she was fine before he left, and she had stood in the middle of her shop after the door closed behind him and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the sense of being seen by someone who was paying attention. The fourth visit, a week before the hearing, he had been less composed. Not visibly, not in any way that someone passing by the window would have noticed. But she had spent enough time in his careful vicinity by then to read the small indicators, the slight tension in his jaw, the way he looked at the thread display for a beat too long. "The hearing is set," he said. "I know, I received notice yesterday. Cobb is filing a counterclaim against you for slander. Orrin is handling it. I know that too." He looked at her then fully, the way he occasionally allowed himself to when he thought she was not going to notice. She always noticed. "The case they are building is designed to make you appear motivated by financial desperation," he said. "They will use the lease situation, the rent increase. They will frame everything you saw as a fabrication born out of your own circumstances. It is a compelling story," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "A penniless seamstress invents a crime to deflect from her own financial failures. I can see how it would be believed." "Not by everyone," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at the thread again. "I will be there," he said, "at the hearing." "It is not required," she said carefully. "No," he agreed. "It is not." And that had been the fourth visit, and it had sat inside her like a small, warm thing she was afraid to look at directly for fear it would disappear. The morning of the hearing, Caldwell felt like a town holding its breath. Ellen had dressed carefully, in her best day dress, a dark blue wool she had made herself with a plain white collar, because she understood that the hearing was not just a legal proceeding. It was a performance for the town's judgment, and she intended to look like a woman who had nothing to hide. She had walked to the courthouse on Main Street alone. She had considered asking someone to accompany her, but there was no one whose company would have been more help than hindrance. Mrs. Hooper, who was the closest thing to a friend she had left since Grace died, had been clearly troubled by the whole situation for weeks. Her loyalty, visibly divided between affection for Ellen and fear of the social consequences of being associated with anyone who had made an enemy of Reginald Cobb. The courthouse was already half full when Ellen arrived, which told her that the hearing had become entertainment. That was perhaps the most disheartening thing of the morning, watching people settle into the benches with the particular eager comfort of an audience that expects a spectacle. The Cattle Association men were already there. The lawyer from Wichita was already there, arranging papers with theatrical precision. Reginald Cobb came in at 5 minutes to the hour. He was a man in his mid-50s with the particular look of someone who had been heavy once and had settled into a kind of solid permanence, as if his weight and his wealth had compressed over time into something denser and harder to move. He sat at the table his lawyer had prepared for him without looking at Ellen, which was a specific kind of dismissal, the kind that said you are already gone from my consideration. The hearing began. Thaddeus Orrin was extraordinary in his unpleasantness. He did not shout or bully. He was far more effective than that. He asked questions in the tone of a man who found the whole enterprise mildly entertaining, and that tone did more damage than any accusation could have, because it implied that the accusation did not even merit real anger. Every time Ellen answered, his small smile suggested that her answer had somehow confirmed his point regardless of its content. She held herself together for the first hour. The questions circled around her financial situation with remorseless efficiency. How much was her rent in arrears? who held the lease on her shop, who had recently informed her that the lease would not be renewed. Who had she spoken to about her financial difficulties in the weeks before her accusations against Mr. Cobb's business interests? Was it not true that Grace Alcott's estate had left Ellen Dalton with shared debts that she was struggling to service? Every yes felt like a stone added to a weight she was carrying. Then Orrin moved to the night at the land office, and here he was even more skilled because he had somehow obtained a statement from Percy Webb. Percy, who had been against the wall looking sick. Percy, who she suspected had been promised something in exchange for his cooperation, safety, or financial relief, or simply the guarantee that he would not be the one they focused on. Percy's statement said that Ellen had come to the land office uninvited on the evening of March 14th, that she had been agitated and demanding, and that she had made statements about Mr. Cobb's operations that had alarmed him. There was no mention of burning documents. There was no Warren bail. There was only Ellen, agitated and demanding. She had looked at the faces in the courtroom after Orrin read that statement aloud, and she had read their verdict in them. Not formal, not declared, but done. The calculation had already run. The woman with the rent arrears and the failed lease and the dead partner had invented a grievance to explain her own failure, and Percy Webb had confirmed it, and that was the story. That was the story that made sense to these people, because it was the story they already knew. Women in trouble made things up. Women in trouble found dragons to fight because the real problems were too humbling to admit. She had heard herself being called a liar in the courtroom's collective face, and she had pressed her hands flat against the railing, and she had not let herself look at the back of the room where the door was, because she did not want to confirm that it was still closed. And then it had opened. The courtroom after Elijah Fletcher's declaration became a different organism entirely. Thaddeus Orrin recovered first because that was his professional skill, the recovery. Marshal Fletcher, he said, with the particular smoothness of a man redirecting a river, the court appreciates your personal convictions. However, this is a legal proceeding and personal belief, however passionately held, does not constitute. Sit down, Mr. Orrin, said Elijah Fletcher. The room went so quiet that Ellen could hear the sound of someone breathing 3 rows behind her. Orrin blinked. It was, she suspected, the first time in many years that anyone had said that to him without consequences. Marshal Fletcher, Judge Price said, his voice carrying now the distinct undertone of a man who is beginning to be concerned. You will address this court through proper. Judge Price, Elijah said, and he turned to face the bench with a respectful inclination of his head that nevertheless communicated absolute refusal to be redirected. I am going to present evidence. If the court would prefer I do that through proper channels with full documentation, I have everything required to file formal charges with the state prosecutor's office in Topeka, including copies of the fraudulent survey filings, a sworn statement from a federal land agent who examined the discrepancies, and the name and location of Warren Bale, who can currently be found at the Drover's Rest Hotel in Wichita, where he has been staying since mid-March. Every head in the room turned toward Reginald Cobb. Cobb's face had done something interesting. The blankness he had maintained all morning had developed a crack in it, a very small crack at the corner of his left eye, a tightening that was not quite fear but was its near neighbor. I can pursue it that way, Elijah continued, in the same quiet, even voice, or Mr. Cobb can choose to address the situation before it becomes a federal matter. Those are the options as I see them. But what is not an option, and here his voice changed, not louder but somehow harder, like a hand closing into a fist, is that Miss Dalton leaves this courtroom without her name being cleared. That is not something I am going to allow. Ellen had to look away from him because she could not hold the sight of it without coming apart entirely. The courtroom erupted, not in the dramatic way of the stories she had heard, not overturned benches and shouting. It erupted in the buzzing, shifting way of a hive disturbed, people turning to one another, the low current of recalculation running through the room like a tide change. Orrin was on his feet. The judge was wielding his gavel. Cobb's expression had closed down completely into something that was no longer blank, but carefully constructed. What happened in the next 2 hours was the methodical unraveling of a hidden architecture. Elijah presented what he had, not dramatically, but with the particular patient clarity of a man who had spent 6 weeks building something solid and was now simply allowing it to be seen. The federal land agent's affidavit, the letters from the state surveyor's office, the record of Warren Bale's civil history, the documented timeline of the survey discrepancies that predated Ellen's accusations by 8 months, which meant that the fraud had been in progress long before any question of her financial situation had arisen, which dismantled Orrin's narrative entirely. Percy Webb, presented with the federal affidavit and informed by Judge Price in very direct terms that further false testimony would carry criminal consequences, changed his statement. He changed it quietly, almost apologetically, staring at the floor and speaking in a voice so low that Price made him repeat himself twice. Yes, he said. There had been a man in the office. Yes, he said. Documents had been burning. Yes, Miss Dalton had come in by accident, and she had not been agitated or demanding. She had been afraid. The room had changed again at that, and Ellen, who had been holding herself so carefully for so many hours, felt the exhaustion of the effort begin to crack through, because fear was something they understood. Fear was something they could read in a woman's account and find true. Thaddeus Orrin withdrew the counterclaim before noon. He did it with the smooth efficiency of a man who recognized a burning building and chose the window. Reginald Cobb sat very still while his lawyer whispered to him, and then Cobb rose and left the courtroom without looking at Ellen, without looking at the marshal, without looking at anyone. It was the departure of a man conserving himself for the longer fight, and Ellen knew this was not over in the full sense, that Cobb had money and lawyers and connections that would not be unraveled in a single morning. But he was gone from the room, and Percy Webb had told the truth, and Judge Price had cleared her name on the official record, and Elijah Fletcher was standing 12 feet away from her watching the judge make his pronouncements with an expression she could not read. She found him outside afterward. He was standing on the boardwalk to the side of the courthouse steps, out of the way of the crowd that was spilling out through the doors, his hat back on his head, looking at the dust of the main street with the particular stillness of a man who has just done something that has cost him something. "You said you were going to find out," she said. "6 weeks ago. You said that was the best you could tell me." He turned to look at her. "When did you move from finding out to believing?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "The second day," he said, "when I confirmed that Bale had been in town the week before you described seeing him. He had signed the guest register at the hotel." The date matched. "You have believed me for 6 weeks," she said. "Yes. And you did not tell me." "I could not tell you until I had something solid enough to act on," he said. "Telling you would only have made it harder for you to keep quiet about it, and if you had known, you might have done something that put you in Cobb's direct line." It was logical. She understood that. She understood it completely. And she was still furious about it in the way you were furious at someone when the thing they had done was correct, but the weight of it had fallen entirely on you. "I was alone in there," she said. Something moved through his expression that was not comfortable to look at. "I know," he said. "For 2 hours I stood there and watched every person in that room decide I was lying, and I knew you were coming because you said you would be there. But I did not know what you were going to say when you arrived, and I could not let myself hope too specifically because—" She stopped, because her voice had done something she had not given it permission to do, and she looked down at the boardwalk planking and pressed her lips together. He did not fill the silence with anything easy. He did not say he was sorry in the reflexive way. People said it when they wanted the discomfort to end. He waited, and when she had collected herself and looked up, he was still there, exactly where he had been, watching her with those steady dark eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Not yet," she said honestly. "That is a reasonable answer," he said. and she had laughed, which surprised her because it was such a precise and considered thing to say in response to something most people would have rushed to reassure away. It was such a completely Elijah Fletcher kind of response, careful and honest and unexpectedly kind in its precision. He looked slightly startled by the laugh, and then something at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the shape of one. "Miss Dalton," he said. "Ellen," she said, "after this morning I think you have earned the use of my given name." "Ellen," he said, and the way he said it was careful in a different way from how he was usually careful. "I would like to take you to supper tonight, if you are agreeable." She looked at him. He was looking at the main street again, a faint line of color along the edge of his jaw that she found unexpectedly affecting. "I am agreeable," she said. They ate at the hotel dining room on the east side of Main Street, which was the only establishment in Caldwell that could be called a proper restaurant, and they sat at the corner table that the hotel reserved for the town's more official occasions, which felt appropriate given what the day had been. The dining room was nearly full, and Ellen was aware of being watched, which was no different from the morning except that the nature of the watching had changed entirely. The shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Mrs. Hooper was there with her husband, and had the grace to look deeply uncomfortable when Ellen met her eyes. Two of the Cattle Association men were at the far table, and they dropped their gazes when Elijah looked at them with the particular flat calm that he seemed to produce without effort. "You have made enemies today," Ellen said, once they had ordered. "Cobb's people will not forget." "They were already my enemies," he said. "They just did not know it. Is that not dangerous?" He considered this with the same honest directness he seemed to bring to everything. "It is a certain kind of dangerous," he said. But the alternative was to watch a woman be legally destroyed by a man who burned evidence to protect a land fraud, and that was not something I was willing to do. "Because it was your job," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said, "because it was wrong." There was a difference in that, and they both knew it, and the fact that they both knew it sat between them at the table with the weight of something not yet named. She asked him over the soup course where he was from, and he told her Kansas City originally, which surprised her because she had assumed frontier-born. He told her about his years as a deputy in 3 different counties before Caldwell, about why he had chosen law enforcement, which had not been a dramatic story at all, but rather the quiet acknowledgement that he was good at reading situations and bad at doing nothing when situations needed intervention. He told her this without pride and without false modesty, in the manner of someone who had simply come to accurate terms with their own nature. She told him about Missouri, about her mother dying when she was 14, and her father's subsequent gradual dissolution into grief, and then whiskey. About her sister, married now to a farmer outside of Independence, who wrote letters that always contained the gentle suggestion that Ellen should come home and find a husband, as if home were still the same place she had left at 20, and as if a husband were a thing you simply went and collected. She said this last part with a lightness that covered a complicated feeling, and Elijah heard the complicated feeling anyway and did not comment on it directly, which was the correct thing to do. He told her about his own family in the spare way of a man who has processed most of his grief privately. His father had died when Elijah was 19, a ranching accident, nothing dramatic, just the ordinary lethal carelessness of hard work. His mother lived still in Kansas City, and he sent money home each month. He had a younger sister named Clara who taught school. "She would like you," he said, and then seemed to consider whether he had said too much, and looked at his food with that jaw-line color she was coming to recognize as his version of visible emotion. "Why?" Ellen asked. "She is very direct," he said. "She does not like people who are not. She would find you direct." "Is that a compliment?" "From Clara, absolutely," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth did become a smile, a real one, brief and warming, and Ellen felt it in her chest like the first warm day after a long winter. The weeks after the hearing reshaped the town's relationship with Ellen in ways she had not entirely anticipated. She had expected vindication to feel cleaner, more complete. Instead, it was a process, slow and sometimes grinding, like water finding new channels after a flood. Reginald Cobb, as she had predicted, did not simply disappear. He withdrew from Caldwell's immediate social landscape, but his legal and financial apparatus continued to operate. The state prosecutor's office in Topeka did open a formal investigation into the land survey fraud, based on Elijah's documentation, and that investigation would run for another 4 months before Cobb agreed to a settlement that included restitution to the 3 homesteading families and the formal voiding of the fraudulent survey amendments. It was not justice in the full sense. It was not prison, and that injustice was something Ellen sat with privately, knowing that a man of Cobb's resources could purchase the lighter consequence, and that the system that enabled that was larger and older than any single hearing. But the homesteading families got their water rights clearly documented. The Dalton Creek corridor was properly surveyed and filed. And those families, the Murrays and the Olsons and the Vasquez family whose patriarch Jose had filed his claim 8 years ago and fought for it against every obstacle the territory could produce. Those families came to Ellen one by one in the weeks after, not to thank her exactly, because they were not people given to elaborate gestures, but to acknowledge what she had done with the particular quiet currency of frontier respect, which was worth more to her than any public ceremony. Warren Bale was arrested in Wichita and charged. Percy Webb was fined and lost his clerk position, but avoided criminal charges on the condition of his full cooperation with the state investigation. These were not perfect outcomes, but they were real ones. The dry goods landlord, evidently concluding that aligning with Cobb's interests was less profitable now that those interests were under legal scrutiny, abruptly reversed the rent increase. Ellen did not thank him for this. She paid the original rate and said nothing. Through all of this, Elijah Fletcher was a presence in her days that grew from occasional to regular to, somewhere in the 5th week after the hearing, quietly necessary. It happened gradually and then suddenly, the way everything true happened. He began stopping by the shop in the late afternoon rather than the middle of the day, which meant the visits were no longer covered by the fiction of midday browsing. They were simply visits. He would sit in the chair she kept near the window for customer consultations and drink the coffee she made on the small iron stove in the back room, and she would keep working while they talked because the rhythm of needle and thread was a useful companion to conversation, giving the hands something to do so the mouth could be honest. He told her things during those visits that she understood. He did not tell many people. He told her about a deputy he had lost 3 years ago in a situation that still ran through his thoughts at night. He told her about the loneliness of the work, not in complaint, but in the manner of someone carefully naming a true thing. He told her about the particular way that the prairie looked at first light in October, which was the month he had arrived in Caldwell, and which he had always considered the best light the Kansas sky produced. She told him things, too, about the fear she had carried during those 6 weeks of waiting, which she had not allowed herself to fully feel until they were past. About the shame that had surprised her in the courtroom, not the shame of being disbelieved. She had been prepared for that, but the shame of needing someone to stand up for her, of not being able to make the truth sufficient on its own. About Grace, who had been her anchor in this place, and whose absence was a daily geography she was still learning to navigate. She used to say, Ellen told him one afternoon in early June, that the hardest part of building a life somewhere new was that you had to build the people too, not just the shop and the home but the actual people who would be your people, and that it took time and it could not be hurried. She was right, Elijah said. I know, Ellen said. I am still in the middle of it. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, I think maybe you have built at least one person. She had looked up from her sewing and found him looking at the window at the late afternoon light on the dusty street, and she had felt something shift in the room the way the air shifted before a storm, not threatening but changed, charged with something about to arrive. I think maybe I have, she said. He had turned to look at her then, and whatever careful professional distance he had maintained for weeks, the slight reserve that had served its purpose during the investigation and the hearing and the careful months of aftermath, that distance had simply closed, not in a rush, but in the quiet certain way of something that had been moving toward its destination all along. "Ellen," he said. "Yes," she said, which was technically not a response to any question he had asked, but was nonetheless the correct answer to the one he had been working up to for weeks. He had smiled then, a full smile, the kind she had glimpsed only at its edges before this, and it had changed his face entirely, not making it different but making it fully itself, and she had thought, looking at him in the late afternoon light, that she would like to have the frequent occasion to see him smile like that. The summer of 1882 in Caldwell was hot and dry and busy, with cattle drives, which meant that Elijah's days were full of the particular lawkeeping required when 10,000 head of longhorns and several hundred trail-weary drovers descended on a town that existed partly to service them. Ellen understood that his time was not his own during drive season, and she did not resent it. She had her own busy season to manage, because the drive crew's month-end pay created a brief flush of consumer spending that extended even to the seamstress on Main Street. They found their time in the early mornings before the day's demands, walking the quieter residential streets before the town was fully awake, and in the occasional Sunday afternoon when his duties permitted, and the town was briefly subdued by the Sabbath. These were not courting rituals in the formal social sense. No chaperone, no calling cards, no parlor visits conducted under watchful parental supervision, because Ellen had no parents in Caldwell and Elijah lived in the rooms above his office, and the formal structures of Eastern courtship had never fully translated to the practical reality of frontier life anyway. What they had was better than ritual. They had honest conversation and the accumulation of knowing, the slow, steady building of understanding that comes from simply spending time in a person's company and finding that the time is the best part of the day. He held her hand for the first time on a Sunday evening in late July, while they were watching the sun go down from the bench outside the livery stable on the south end of town. He simply reached over and took her hand and held it, and she turned it in his and held it back, and neither of them said anything about it because there was nothing to say. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday morning in August, on the boardwalk outside her shop door, which was not a planned occasion. She had been telling him something about a customer's impossible request, and she had looked up from the key she was turning in the lock to find him looking at her with an expression of such clear and unguarded warmth that she had simply stopped speaking, and he had leaned down and kissed her, briefly and very gently, and then stepped back and looked slightly as if he was reconsidering something. "Marshal," she said. "That was," he began. "Very much all right," she said firmly. He had looked relieved in the way of a man who has been holding something carefully and has just been told he can set it down. In September, he asked her to marry him. He did not ask in a grand public gesture. He asked on the walk home from the Sunday evening church service, which they had begun attending together in August partly out of genuine faith, and partly because Caldwell was small enough that their courtship needed some public structure to give it appropriate form, and they both found value in the hour of quiet and the music. He had been quiet most of the walk, which was unlike him even though he was not a talkative man, because his quiet usually had a comfortable texture and this one had something underneath it. "You are thinking very hard about something," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Would it help to say it?" she asked. "Probably," he said. And then, still walking, still looking at the street ahead, he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me, and I have been trying to determine the right way to do it, and I have concluded that there is no right way except directly, which is how you deserve to have everything said to you." She had stopped walking. He had taken 2 more steps before he realized and turned back to face her. "I know this town has been hard on you," he said. "I know it did not cover itself in honor in that courtroom in March. I know you have built something here anyway, which tells me something about who you are. I would like to be part of what you are building. I would like very much to build something with you." He paused. "That is the best version of what I am trying to say." She looked at him standing on the street in the September evening light, this careful and honest and quietly extraordinary man who had stood up in front of everyone and said he believed her, who had spent 6 weeks building a case in the dark so she would not be left alone in the light, who drank her coffee and held her hand and had never once said anything to her that was not fully true. "Yes," she said again, which was still the correct answer. He had come to her then, crossing the 2 steps between them, and taken her face in both his hands with a gentleness that seemed slightly in excess of his usual precise economy of motion, as if the feeling required more of him than the practical world usually did, and kissed her in the middle of the September street in the fading evening light. And it had been so warm and so sure that she had felt the entirety of the last difficult year. The grief of Grace's death, and the loneliness and the fear, and the horrible morning in the courtroom, begin at last to settle into the past where it belonged. They married on the 15th of October, 1882, on the day that Elijah had told her produced the best light in Kansas. He had been right. The October sky over Caldwell was a particular shade of blue that seemed deeper than summer blue, more serious and more clear, and the cottonwood trees along the creek at the edge of town had gone gold, and the air had the clean, cold edge of the coming season without having lost the warmth of the one just past. The ceremony was in the small Methodist church on Elm Street, performed by Reverend Harker, who was a plain and practical man of faith who conducted the service without excessive ornamentation. Ellen wore her best dress, a deep burgundy wool she had made specifically for the occasion, with a white collar and cuffs that she had worked with the most careful embroidery she knew, small leaves and a single repeated blossom pattern that had taken her 2 weeks of evenings. She had ordered fabric for it before Elijah had even formally asked her, which she chose not to tell him about because it seemed presumptuous, and also because the secret of it made her happy. Elijah wore his good suit, and had the marshal's badge conspicuously absent from it, which she understood was his way of being there as himself rather than as a function. Clara Fletcher had come from Kansas City for the wedding, arriving 2 days before on the morning stage. She was 26, compact and decisive, with her brother's dark eyes but none of his stillness, instead a kind of vibrant, directed energy that filled a room without overwhelming it. She had taken one look at Ellen in the stage depot where Ellen and Elijah had come to collect her, and said, "Oh good, you are exactly what I thought you would be," which was not a conventional greeting but was, from Clara, the highest compliment. Ellen's sister Ruth could not make the journey from Missouri on such short notice, but she sent a letter that had arrived the week before, a letter so warm and so genuinely happy that Ellen had read it 3 times, and then folded it small and kept it in her dress pocket until the wedding day. Ruth wrote that she could hear in Ellen's letters the voice of a woman who had found something true, and that she hoped the marshal understood how fortunate he was, and that she planned to visit in the spring no matter what her husband said about the distance. The homesteading families came to the wedding. The Murrays brought a quilt that Mrs. Murray had made in the traditional double wedding ring pattern, in the blues and creams and tobacco browns that Eleanor Murray said reminded her of the Kansas sky. Jose Vasquez and his wife, Maria, came with their eldest son Tomás, who was 12 and very serious about the occasion, and shook Elijah's hand with both of his own in a gesture so formal and heartfelt that Ellen had to swallow hard to maintain composure. The Olson family brought smoked meats, and a jar of the honey their bees made from the clover in the Dalton Creek bottomland that was now legally and permanently theirs. Mrs. Hooper came. She sat near the back and looked throughout the ceremony like a woman performing some private accounting, and afterward she came to Ellen and said, with the difficulty of someone who did not apologize easily, "I should have been better." It was not very much as apologies went, but it was genuine, and Ellen received it genuinely. The wedding supper afterward was held in the hotel dining room, and it was the warmest room Ellen had been in since she had lost Grace, the warmth of people choosing to be together, choosing to celebrate something, choosing to let the accumulation of a hard year become the foundation of something good. Clara gave a toast that was 3/4 affectionate mockery of her brother, and 1/4 the most sincerely beautiful articulation of hope that Ellen had ever heard from a practical woman. Elijah endured the first 3/4 with the contained stoicism of a man who loves his sister deeply and finds her exhausting in equal measure, and the last quarter with an expression of unguarded love that Ellen filed carefully in the part of her memory she intended to revisit often. They danced, which she had not expected of him, but he was a careful and competent dancer in the way he was careful and competent at most things, not showy but steady and sure, and dancing with him was like most things with him, better than the version you had imagined. They took up residence in the house on Maple Street that Elijah had rented in the summer in anticipation, a small but solid clapboard house with a kitchen garden and a porch that faced east and caught the morning sun. Ellen brought her sewing work to the back room of the house and continued her shop on Main Street, not because they needed the income particularly, his marshal's salary being adequate if not generous, but because the work was hers and she had built it herself, and she had no intention of abandoning it just because she now had a husband. Elijah had agreed to this immediately and without discussion, which told her something about him that she had already known but was glad to have confirmed. The first winter of their marriage was a good one. Not without its difficulties. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard in Kansas, cold that arrived early and stayed late, 2 storms that blanketed the town in December that kept everyone indoors for days. But indoor days with Elijah Fletcher turned out to be among Ellen's favorite kind of days. He read extensively, which she had not known before they lived together, novels and territorial newspapers and the legal codes of 3 different states, and he read silently and without performance, which meant she could sew at the kitchen table, and he could read in the armchair by the stove, and they could be in the same room for hours in a quiet so comfortable it had the quality of something built. He told her once in January that he had never been good at the social performance of happiness, the obligatory expressions of contentment that the public world required. "I am not unhappy," he said. "I have generally been not unhappy, but I was not aware of being actively happy until this year." Since the hearing, she asked. He had looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she now knew very well. "Since the 4th visit," he said, "when you said you were fine." "You could tell I was not actually fine," she said. "Yes," he said. "And I came back to check anyway, and you still said you were fine, and I found that," he paused, choosing words with his usual careful precision. "I found that I very much wanted to be the person who kept coming back to check." She had put down her work and looked at him fully, this man who expressed love in checking and building and standing up in front of rooms when it was necessary and asking careful questions and coming back, always coming back. "You are," she said. "You are exactly that person." Spring arrived in Caldwell the way it always did, with mud and promise in equal measure, and Ruth arrived in April as she had promised, with her husband Thomas, who turned out to be a steady and quietly decent man who visibly adored Ruth, which was everything Ellen had needed to know about him. Ruth's visit lasted 3 weeks and was, in the particular way of time spent with someone you have known your whole life, simultaneously too short and almost overwhelming in its fullness. They talked about their mother, about their father who had died the previous fall according to a letter from a family friend in Missouri, which Ellen had received with a grief that was old and layered and complicated by all the years of his absence from her life. They talked about the future, about Ruth's farm and the children she was hoping for, and about Ellen's life in Caldwell, which Ruth assessed with the shrewd, affectionate scrutiny of an older sister, and declared both genuinely good and extremely hard one. "He is better than I hoped for you," Ruth told her, On the last evening before the Alcotts departed, when they were sitting on the east porch in the late spring warmth and Elijah and Thomas were inside finishing the last of the whiskey and talking in the comfortable way of men who have gotten past the introduction stage. "And I hoped for quite a lot." "I know," Ellen said. "You deserve to be believed," Ruth said, which was the thing she had not said in any of the letters but had clearly been wanting to say in person. "You always told the truth, even when you were small and it would have been easier not to." Ellen looked at the April sky and felt the truth of that settle in her bones, not as a wound anymore but as a fact. She had told the truth. Someone had believed her. From that believing, from that single act of standing up in a room full of doubt and saying "I believe her," everything else had grown. In June, Ellen told Elijah she was expecting. She had waited until she was certain, which had taken several weeks of the particular private arithmetic of a woman who is paying close attention to her own body. She told him on a Wednesday evening in the kitchen, while they were doing the after-supper washing up, which was perhaps not the dramatic setting the occasion might have merited in a romantic novel, but which felt exactly right for the honest, daily, real texture of their life together. He had gone completely still. The way he went still was not the stillness of shock exactly, more the stillness of a person who has received something so large they need a moment before they can move with it. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He had set down the dish towel. He had turned to face her completely, and then he had pulled her into his arms with a care and a certainty that she felt in every part of her, his face against her hair, and he had said, very quietly, "Good." She had laughed, because it was the most Elijah Fletcher response possible, and she felt him smile against her hair, and they stood in the kitchen of the house on Maple Street in the June evening light for a long moment that neither of them was in a hurry to end. He worried throughout the pregnancy, which he did in the way he did everything, quietly and practically and productively. He acquired a medical reference text from the doctor's office and read it cover to cover. He adjusted his work schedule to ensure he was home each evening. He consulted Dr. Patterson, the town doctor, with a thoroughness that Dr. Patterson found both admirable and slightly excessive, telling Ellen afterward that he had never had a father to come to him with a written list of questions, which was, she explained, simply how Elijah Fletcher approached things he cared about. She kept working through the summer and into the fall, sewing and running the shop and living her days, and the pregnancy was good and healthy and relatively uncomplicated, which she was grateful for. The women of Caldwell rallied around in the way of frontier communities, not with elaborate social ceremony, but with practical gifts and useful information, and the occasional afternoon of company that was offered simply and without expectation of return. Mrs. Murray came with preserved fruit and the name of the midwife she trusted. Maria Vasquez came with herbs her mother had used and recipes, and the comfortable authority of a woman who had delivered 5 children successfully. Even Mrs. Hooper, who had been slowly and imperfectly repairing her relationship with Ellen over the course of the year, came with a knitted blanket in yellow and white wool, and sat with her for an afternoon in October, and talked about ordinary things in a way that was its own kind of peace offering. Their son was born in December of 1883, in the bedroom of the house on Maple Street, with the midwife Mrs. Garrett in attendance and Elijah in the kitchen performing the particular purgatory of the waiting father, who is close enough to hear everything and too far to help with anything. Ellen's labor was long and honest work, which was the only way she knew how to do difficult things, directly and without self-deception about the difficulty. When it was finished and Mrs. Garrett placed the baby in her arms, Ellen looked at him for a long moment, at this small and absolute new person, and felt something that had no useful words, only the physical fact of it, which was total and transforming and old as humanity. Elijah was called in almost immediately after, because Mrs. Garrett was a practical woman who had seen too many men kept waiting on convention's behalf when the real business was tenderness, and he crossed the room to the bed in 3 steps and looked at the baby in Ellen's arms with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was to say a face with no guard on it at all, completely open, everything he was visible at once. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, in a voice she had not heard him use before. The baby, who was 7 hours old and had opinions already, made an indignant sound. Elijah looked at Ellen with an expression that was stunned and wondering and deeply, privately happy in the way that the best things in his life seemed to reach him, quietly and completely. "Thomas James Fletcher," Ellen said, which she had decided in the last weeks of the pregnancy without consulting him because she had wanted to see his face when she said it. Thomas for Ruth's husband, who had been the first brother she had chosen, and James for Elijah's father. His jaw worked. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the baby and then at her and then back at the baby. "That is," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said. He took her free hand and held it, and they sat in the December lamplight of the bedroom on Maple Street with Thomas James Fletcher making his introductory observations about the world. And Ellen thought that all of it, every hard month and frightening moment and courtroom humiliation and cold night of waiting, had led to this room and this man and this baby and this life, and that she would walk every step of it again. The year 1884 brought changes to Caldwell with the particular speed of a frontier town in growth. The cattle trade was evolving. The railroad had changed the geometry of commerce in ways that were remaking the entire region, and the town was debating its own future with the energy of a place that could feel time moving underneath its feet. Elijah was re-elected marshal in the spring election, which was not contested, which said something about how the hearing and its aftermath had settled into the town's understanding of itself. There were those who would never fully reconcile to having been wrong that morning in the courthouse, and that was a human limitation that Ellen had long since decided to carry without resentment. But the majority of Caldwell had concluded, in the practical frontier manner, that a marshal who built cases on truth and stood up for the right thing was the marshal they wanted, and they voted accordingly. Ellen's shop continued to grow, and she hired a young woman named Ada Briggs who had come to Caldwell the previous fall as a seamstress's apprentice, quick-handed and good-humored, and who freed Ellen to manage the business side of things with more of the energy that had previously gone to the needlework. It was a good arrangement, and Ada proved herself reliable and eventually necessary. Thomas was a vigorous baby who became a vigorous small boy, at a velocity that seemed slightly faster than physics should have permitted. He had his father's dark eyes and Ellen's way of sitting very still when he was thinking, which made him seem at certain moments absurdly like a small Elijah, and those moments were among Ellen's persistent sources of private joy. Clara came for Christmas of 1884 and held Thomas with the confident authority of someone who had decided to be an excellent aunt, and was applying herself to it systematically. She and Ellen had developed by this time a friendship independent of the family connection, trading letters every few weeks, a correspondence that had evolved from polite getting to know you into genuine honest exchange. And Clara's Christmas visit had the warmth of two people who were genuinely glad to see each other. Elijah watched the two of them talking over the Christmas dinner with the particular expression he wore when he was happier than he quite knew what to do with. In the spring of 1885, the state investigation into Cobb's land fraud was finally fully resolved. Cobb paid restitution and did not go to prison, which was the outcome Ellen had expected, and which was still, in its incompleteness, an injustice she acknowledged plainly. But the Vasquez family's deed was re-registered with the correct survey boundaries. The Murray homestead's water rights were confirmed in writing that had now been reviewed by the state surveyor's office and 3 lawyers. The Olson land was properly documented. Jose Vasquez came to the house on Maple Street on the day the confirmation arrived in the mail from Topeka, and he sat at the kitchen table, and Ellen made coffee and Elijah came in from the office and they sat together, the 3 of them, while Jose read the document twice through in silence. Then Jose looked up and said 8 years, which was how long he had been fighting for this land, and there was in those 2 words the full weight of 8 years of uncertainty and fear, and the particular exhaustion of fighting a system that had never been designed with his victory in mind. "It is done now," Ellen said. "Yes," Jose said. "It is done." He stayed for an hour. They talked about his son Tomás, who was now 14 and had decided he wanted to be a lawyer, a decision Jose found both alarming and secretly wonderful. They talked about the land and the spring planting and the cattle his eldest daughter had bought with her own savings, a transaction the whole family was enormously proud of. When he left, he shook Elijah's hand and then turned to Ellen and said, "You did something brave." And she had opened her mouth to say that she had not been brave at all, that she had been terrified, but he shook his head before she could. "Afraid and brave are the same thing," he said. "That is what I have learned. They are always the same thing." She thought about that for a long time afterward. The summer of 1885 was the kind of summer that Caldwell would talk about for years, not for disaster but for abundance. The rains were well timed and the grass was deep, and the cattle drives were large and prosperous, and the town had the feeling of a place that had found its stride. Main Street was busier than Ellen had ever seen it. Ada was running the shop with increasing autonomy and confidence. Thomas was 2.5, and had recently discovered that he could climb most things that a reasonable person would have thought unclimbable. Ellen was expecting again by July, which she told Elijah with less ceremony than the first time because they were both older hands at this now, and he received it with the same quiet and total warmth that she had come to understand was how he registered the things that mattered most to him. This pregnancy was different from the first, not worse, but different in the way that second children are often different from first, which is to say experienced differently, with less new fear and more attention available for the enjoyment of it. She knew more about what her body was doing and why. She felt the baby move earlier and recognized it for what it was immediately, and sat very still for a moment when she first felt it, the particular conversation of life beginning its reply to the world. Their daughter was born in February of 1886. She arrived more quickly than Thomas had, and announced her presence with considerably more volume, which the midwife said was a very good sign, and which Elijah received in the kitchen with visible relief when Mrs. Garrett told him. When he came into the bedroom this time, he did not cross the room in 3 steps. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Ellen holding the baby, and his expression was something she filed very carefully alongside every other moment she had been keeping. A man at the door of a room he has been afraid to enter because the good thing inside it is too much to hold until he has prepared himself for the size of it. "Come and meet your daughter," she said. He crossed the room. He sat beside her. He took the baby very carefully, with the particular careful confidence of a father who has done this once before, and the baby opened her eyes and looked up at him with the unfocused but determined gaze of the newly arrived, and he said, as he had said to Thomas, "Hello." "Margaret Clara Fletcher," Ellen said. "If you agree." He looked up. "Clara will be insufferable about this," he said. "I know," Ellen said. "It is worth it." He looked back at Margaret, who was looking at him with the unnerving intensity of all newborns, and his face was doing that thing it did when he was completely unguarded, every wall down, everything true. "Yes," he said, "it is entirely worth it." Clara received the news of her namesake with a letter that arrived 2 weeks later and ran to 4 pages, which was a record even for Clara, and which contained in its final paragraph a sentence that Ellen read aloud to Elijah at the breakfast table. "I expect you to tell Margaret that she has the finest aunt in Kansas and possibly the full territory, and I further expect that this aunt will be in Caldwell by the end of March. No argument." Elijah took a sip of his coffee and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth was doing its thing. The years moved. Not faster, not in the way people sometimes claimed years moved with age, but with more substance, each one fuller than the last, packed with the particular density of a life being lived rather than merely endured. Thomas started school in 1887, marching into the schoolhouse on the first day of the term, with the focused determination of a boy who had been told that letters were important and had taken this information with complete seriousness. His teacher, a young woman named Miss Franks who was in her first year of teaching, reported to Ellen at the end of the first week that Thomas was the most serious student she had, and also occasionally the most puzzling, because he asked questions that required her to think in ways she had not expected. Ellen had laughed at this and thought, yes, that sounds exactly right. Margaret was walking by 10 months and talking in full sentences by 18, which seemed improbable but was documented by multiple witnesses. She had Ellen's coloring and Elijah's still watchfulness, which was an unusual combination, a bright-complexioned child with those dark, observant eyes, and the effect was striking. She was also, by the age of 2, clearly going to be the family's primary disruptor, which Elijah seemed to find both alarming and secretly fascinating. The town around them settled and grew. The cattle trade era was changing. The fencing of the open range was already altering the landscape of the industry in ways that every rancher and drover and marshal in Kansas could feel coming. New people arrived. The railroad brought commerce and complexity, and the inevitable frictions of a place defining its future. There were difficult seasons and good ones, drought years and flush years, and through all of it the marshal's office on Main Street remained the stable center of the town's legal life, and the house on Maple Street with its east-facing porch remained the stable center of Ellen and Elijah's. Elijah served 3 more terms as marshal. Ellen's shop became the most established dressmaking business in 3 counties, and Ada eventually bought into it as a partner, which was what Ellen had hoped for, because it meant the thing she had built would outlast her immediate involvement, would become something self-sustaining. In the fall of 1889, Kansas was finally admitted to the Union as a state, which was not directly their news to make but which felt, in the particular way of people who had built their lives in a place, like a confirmation. The territory they had made their home now had the full standing they had always known it deserved. They celebrated at the hotel dining room, at the corner table, the same one where they had eaten supper the night of the hearing, the night Elijah had asked if she was agreeable to supper, and she had said yes, the first of all the yesies. They went alone, a rare evening without the children who were with Mrs. Garrett, who had become their trusted standby in the years since the births. They ate and talked and sat in the good quiet of people who have been talking for years and have not run out of things to say. "Do you remember the first time we were here?" he asked. "You asked if I was agreeable," she said. "You said yes with such immediate confidence that I felt I might have been too slow about the whole thing," he said. "You were," she said pleasantly. He smiled. The full smile, the one that changed his face into its full self. "Yes," he said, "I was." She reached across the table and took his hand, the way he had taken hers on the bench outside the livery in July of 1882, simply and without preamble, because it was the most natural motion in the world. "I am glad you stood up," she said, not for the first time. She had said it in various forms and at various moments in the years between that day and this one, but this night it felt worth saying in full, clean, and plain. "I am glad you came to my office," he said. "At 20 minutes past 9, she said. "At 20 minutes past 9, he agreed. "Which was," he said, "not the most respectable hour." "No," she said, "but necessary." "Yes," he said, with the particular weight he put on a yes when he meant it completely. "Absolutely necessary." Outside the hotel window, the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, was lit by the lamp posts that had been installed the previous year, casting their warm, irregular light on the boardwalk and the dusty street, and the people moving through their evening lives in the newly designated state of Kansas. The same street where she had walked alone on a March morning thinking she was going to be destroyed. The same town that had turned its face away and then turned it back. The same sky that Elijah had told her produced its best light in October, which was still true, which was always true. She had told the truth. He had believed her. From that single act of faith, from that moment when one man stood up in a room full of doubt and said, clearly and without qualification, that he believed every word of it, everything she had and everything she was had been born. It was not a small thing being believed. It was perhaps the most significant thing one person could offer another, the willingness to stand when standing was costly, to say I see you and I know you to be true when the room around you was tilted entirely the other way. She had never forgotten it. She never would. And sitting in the hotel dining room in the lamplight, her hand in Elijah's across the table, the sound of a new state celebration in the street outside, and the knowledge of her children sleeping safe in the house on Maple Street, and the full settled weight of a life built on truth and believed in. She thought that this was what it meant to have found your people. Not just the people you loved, but the person who had made it possible to love and be loved, who had stood up when it mattered and said, without reservation, yes, I believe her. She believed him too, in everything, completely. And that, at the end of the day and the end of the year, and the end of all the stories that had wound them together, was the truest thing either of them had ever had.